ora and welcome to Co-op Leader Conversations. I'm Sia Warlick, CEO of Cooperative Business New Zealand. In this conversation, we're hearing from two globally recognised experts in co-ops and mutuals, Professor Dionne Pohler and Dr. Marc-Andre Pigeon. Professor Pohler is an internationally recognised expert on co-op governance and performance. She's based at the Cornell University's Industrial and Labour Relations School and previously held the Cooperative Retailing System Chair in Co-op Governance at the University of Saskatchewan's Johnson Suyama Graduate School of Public Policy and the Canadian Centre for the Study of Cooperatives. In this unique role, she worked closely with boards, executives and policymakers to understand why some co-ops thrive while others fail, translating research into practical insights for resilient and values-based leadership. Dr. Marc-Andre Pigeon is the director at the Canadian Centre for the Study of Cooperatives and an assistant professor in the Johnson Suyama Graduate School of Public Policy. His research centres around the study of co-ops, governance, and money and banking. Their work provides a global perspective on many of the questions co-op leaders are grappling with today. But before we move into the conversation, perhaps you could briefly introduce yourselves and the work you do. And so to kick that off, I'll pass to you, Dionne.
So the work that I did and continue to do with the Canadian Centre for the Study of Cooperatives over the years, both with Marc-Andre and with other colleagues that have been there, a lot of my earlier work focused on cooperative development in rural and Indigenous communities in Western Canada. We were interested in why new cooperatives were not forming over the last couple of decades in the same numbers that they formed when many of the large cooperatives that we now know, those in that era that they were forming. And so we did a major project looking at cooperative development, what kinds of factors facilitate it, what would be needed to encourage the creation of more new co-ops. And out of that project, actually, we created a nonprofit organization called Cooperatives First that has really been doing a lot of great work in Western Canada around the development of new cooperatives and helping even current and established cooperatives thrive. So that was an early, very large project that I had done some work on. And then in the other sort of major area of my research in cooperatives is on governance and management of cooperative retails and credit unions, really focusing in particular on the failures of large cooperative retailing systems like Co-op Atlantic in Eastern Canada, but also the very incredible successes of very large co-ops and cooperative retailing systems in Western Canada. And in both cases, I focused a lot in depth on governance and management issues as some of the reasons for those successes and failures.
Thank you for that. Marc-Andre.
Yeah, so I think it's important to kind of preface what I'm about to say by noting I'm a kind of late blooming academic. I came into this space pretty late in life. I had a lot of practical experience in the policymaking world and with the credit union sector. So my research is kind of shaped by that trajectory. So I'm very much kind of oriented towards situating our center and the research projects around work that's kind of academically robust, but also relevant to the cooperative sector and to policymakers. So that's my sweet spot. And so a lot of my work kind of picks up where I left off in the credit union sector. I do a lot of research around that. Dionne and I just completed a study on the future of smaller credit unions in Canada, Western Canada. And then the other kind of big thematic areas that we're hitting that kind of hits those three kind of objectives are around governance. So Dionne mentioned that we have a large scale governance survey we do every 3 years, sampling about 150 co-ops and credit unions in Canada. We collect a lot of basic governance data that then can be used to benchmark co-ops. We have a director's training that we do for cooperatives as well. And we'll probably come back to that theme as we move through the conversation. And then one last thing I'll mention that I think is important to emphasize. We do this annual survey every year. We ask people in the cooperative sector, what do you think are the big issues facing the cooperative sectors? And for the last, I'd say 8 or 9 years, awareness is the number one issue. And so we've really kind of pushed the development of case studies that can be used in business schools, not just in Canada, but around the world, in New Zealand as well, that kind of are centered around cooperatives. And so we've in the last year or so, we've kind of gotten around 10 of these case studies written. They're very engaging, fun to read, very practical, and they're meant for faculty to use to kind of really pull out for the students what's distinctive about the model. We also think there's application in the governance space as well. In fact, Dionne and I have worked some of that content into our governance training.
That's really interesting, and thank you both for that summary. So you talked about awareness, and certainly we have experienced the same thing here, and we'll definitely touch on that later in the conversation. So, one of the really interesting things about co-ops and mutuals is that they are large globally, but the model is still really misunderstood. So partly, obviously, that's to do with awareness in mainstream business thinking. And I was reflecting recently on the International Cooperative Alliance work that was carried out last year. And their research put the top 300 co-ops and mutuals on about US dollars 2.4 trillion in revenue. So that's not small at all. And they estimate that more than 3 billion people are served by co-ops and mutuals globally. So, you've talked about awareness, but for a model that's so all-encompassing, what misconceptions do you encounter most often?
Well, I think one of them is just what you said. I don't think people understand the reach of cooperatives around the world. I
Right.
think I actually had a student in my office the other day telling me, and I didn't even know this stat, that the cooperative movement is actually much larger than the labor movement, which has always been seen as a large global movement. But I think there's other misconceptions. Marc-Andre, talked about this survey that we've done. So in that survey and also in conversations with people about our research, a lot of people aren't aware that co-ops can be really large, profitable businesses. I think that there's often a misconception when I'm talking to people in the broader public and students that co-ops are all nonprofits and that they're very small, that they don't scale. I think New Zealand and Canada are two great examples of how that's just not the case. But I also think that it's somewhat related to that common misconception is that, and maybe it's not a misconception, it's a lack of understanding of the model, but people really don't understand the ownership and governance structure of co-ops very well. And I think even more so than that, even if people can wrap their head around the ownership and governance structure of locally owned co-ops, they really struggle with how cooperative systems are structured. So when you have what I call second-tier co-ops that are owned by other businesses or owned by other cooperatives, I think that people really struggle to understand those kinds of systems of co-ops, in particular because they're not vertically integrated in the same way as investor-owned firms, and they're not top-down decision making. They're often very much rooted in community and bottom-up decision making, and I think those are things that people struggle with, especially as co-ops grow and become these large profitable businesses.
Can I add to that, Saya? Because I think
Yeah, absolutely.
there's a third thing that I completely agree with Dionne on those. Those are probably the two top misunderstandings. But speaking as someone who's worked in the policy space for a good long while, I can say there's also a failure to understand just how much the institutional structures of our economy, I'm guessing New Zealand economy, but generally kind of modern day market-based societies have incredible incentives for investor-owned businesses that are not matched in any way by the incentives for the cooperative sector. So the kind of very simple example, and I used to work in taxation policy, the federal government here. The very simple example is in Canada, we have this really generous tax measure that you only have to include 50% of your capital gain and income. The other 50% is tax-free. There's nothing analogous, and that's worth billions and billions of dollars of effectively subsidizing the capital raising of by private businesses. There's nothing even close to similar for cooperatives, right? In fact, I'd say mostly the tax structure is quite punitive. But you can look beyond the tax system. You see that just the process of incorporating a cooperative is harder and more laborious than it is for an investor-owned business. Raising capital, Securities Act regulations are not meant for cooperatives. So there's this kind of endless array of new policies often get introduced that don't even include the word cooperatives as a potential business that could leverage these policies. So there's just kind of this big kind of disadvantage at the institutional level that policymakers don't understand, that the average citizen doesn't understand, and that bias people to thinking that the model can't succeed. But what they're not considering is the rules of the game are really tilted against the cooperative sector.
And actually the flip side of that too, and I think this is something that has happened in New Zealand, from my understanding based on some of my recent reading about some of the current events around cooperatives there, is that there's also, as co-ops get bigger, and then they start sort of getting more attention for different reasons, right? Policymakers often also then just think they're like other investor-owned firms. And for instance, think like, in the case of New Zealand where the co-op is one of two in a certain industry, right? And thinking that there's problems with that. And so then they start to kind of treat them, in a way that with these sort of like almost like anti-competition rules should apply in the same way. And I think that's so it's sort of like the flip side of, some people think co-ops are just these small nonprofits, but yet when they become big business, people don't understand that they are still different than other types of big business that are investor owned. So I think it kind of can also work both ways. They can either be completely ignored or then paid a lot of attention to, but that lack of understanding of the ownership and governance model can really cause a lot of harm to co-ops being able to actually be successful and continue to operate as co-ops.
Just a quick hot pursuit on that again, Saya. Sorry, but this is one of Dionne's areas. I'm going to just put it out there. But in the labor relations space too, we had a major strike at a cooperative-owned oil refinery here a couple of years ago, and people failed to appreciate the kind of distinction between the co-op negotiating with its union employees. The co-op was framed as this kind of profit-hungry business without anyone kind of realizing that all that money flows back out into community. And it's not flowing out to some distant investor in Europe or in the United States. It's actually staying local, and it helps subsidize the groceries for many, many rural citizens. So it's not the simple story that is typically told between capital and labor. When you get into the cooperative space, again, that misunderstanding plays out in so many ways. And that's just another example.
Yeah. I mean, I think what you're describing is almost like systemic challenges for cooperatives and mutuals, sort of right up from startup,
Right.
organizations sort of right through to really established organizations. So yeah, certainly we all collectively have a job to do on awareness raising, that's for sure. Yeah, that was a really, really interesting initial topic there. So what I'm really keen to move to now is more around what makes co-ops successful. So, we've talked a little bit about in New Zealand recently, some of the public discussion about co-ops has been focused on some of the challenges, some of the structural change in large cooperatives. But one of the really striking things that our research has shown and that, is common around the world is that how long co-ops last compared to many investor-owned firms. And so that really suggests that they operate strategically on a completely different time horizon. So with that in mind, what do you think it actually takes to sustain the cooperative institution across multiple generations?
Well, I mean, I think the first thing I would say, I do come from more of a business background and training. And one of the things that I think makes co-op successful is what makes any organization successful. Really strong management practices, good culture, good HR practices, like creating like all of the same things internally to an organization that make other organizations successful internally is what makes co-ops successful and thrive. But one of the things I think that's unique to co-ops is that the co-op model can be a strategic advantage if it's viewed that way, right? If the leaders and the board members and the members see the cooperative model as a comparative advantage rather than like a weakness. And so I think that's one of the things as well. There has to be this understanding and this belief and knowledge about how to leverage that model to be able to leverage that advantage. And I think that's really in the work that I've done and with Marc-Andre, that's really what separates the co-ops that succeed from the co-ops that fail. But I don't want to undermine or underemphasize the importance as well of good policies, procedures, HR practices, culture. That's also absolutely critical. You can't overcome that just by being a co-op if you haven't sort of paid attention to those internal management practices and leadership issues. But I think that, if that's, all else equal, what separates the successful co-ops from the ones that don't succeed over the long term is really leveraging the cooperative model.
And I think just to lean into something Dionne just said, I think the good practice. One thing that I think that could be a little distinctive, and it's about that cooperative model, but also just kind of good common sense business practice, is a very strong sense of purpose and mission. Right. The example I'd give, we had a very large retail cooperative, Mountain Equipment Cooperative. Here's like a REI in the United States. They sold outdoor wilderness gear. And, if you looked at their growth trajectory, it was like, straight up for about 40 years. Members, sales, everything. And they had this tremendous discipline in two ways. They had a very clear mission statement that everyone in the organization knew, and it helped make efficient decisions. Just that generalized understanding of what they were there to do and why was a powerful lever. They made use of the constraining tax environment in a thoughtful way. Even though I was saying earlier there's challenges there, I think, they used what they could from the structures to their advantage. They were really strategic about that. And then they leaned into as Dionne was saying, they leaned into the model by very carefully listening and adapting their product offering and strategy based on what members were saying. So they leaned into the model. They didn't kind of necessarily fall into the practices of other businesses and doing like large scale surveys of anonymous people, but they really want their members to speak as members, and so they would do listening tours across the country. The board would to the retails. They'd go out to the retails and hear what people were saying. So they had that kind of firsthand, really direct relationship with the members. They had hotlines to the board. The board wrote a newsletter. I mean, they were really leveraging that relationship in a way that I think a lot of co-ops forget they should do, and that can be a real big strength too.
Yeah, Mountain Equipment Co-op is actually a great example of the same organization that did it well for so long and then stopped doing those things and then ended up failing as a cooperative, is no longer a cooperative, demutualized. And so I think that's a great example of a case where a co-op did it that way for a long time and then stopped doing those exact same things. And
and I guess that that voice of customer / voice of member, that's a commonality of strong business success regardless of what type of ownership model you have. That's for sure.
It is, but one of the differences I think between the member and the customer, the member of a co-op and the customer of any type of business, is that the member is the owner, controls it, is the primary user and beneficiary of the co-op, whereas a customer doesn't have all of those multiple roles. And I think it's also those multiple roles that need to be leaned into as part of the model. So not just treating the member as a customer is key. And I think that is one of the things that separates, again, and successful co-ops from the co-ops that aren't successful. But it's also one of the key things I think that makes co-ops, to your point earlier, more likely to survive, is because they have to focus really carefully on what the member wants, because the member is also an owner and user. And so the member has these multiple roles, and so they have to engage with them far more than they do with a regular business does with their customers.
Right. And then tangibly, I mean, also that also means that you orient yourself towards the member differently. So you're not looking to exploit them. You're looking to meet their needs, right? And so there is a really important but subtle member versus customer distinction. I work in financial services, or I have, and the banks and others are always looking to pull every penny out of your pocket as much as they can, right? But you should not and would not do that if you were thinking in a kind of cooperative way with your members. And in fact, in MEC's case, Mountain Equipment Co-op's case, the members were very strong supporters of that mission statement, which we will be the lowest cost on average provider of outdoor goods in the country, right? And so they, anytime that there was a management push to kind of adjust that, members would show up and protect the integrity of that mission until it all started coming undone. We can talk about that later if you're interested. But the point is that the members were leaning into all those roles to support that mission. And so it's really important to not to conflate that, not to fall into that conflation of member customer.
Member plus customer. Yeah. No, that's really interesting. And Marc-Andre, you mentioned in the first part of the conversation about the role that the board was playing that was slightly different. The board was more like an open door, and there were communications directly coming out from the board. So when you look across, your knowledge and understanding of co-ops, are there specific governance or leadership patterns that show up again and again in a successful co-op?
Am I answering that one first? I guess that was.
You go ahead first, Marc-Andre.
Okay. Yeah, I think there's a kind of I think there has to be a bit of courage about that relationship. It's a hard thing. I think, especially in modern governance kind of norms, is that the board should keep and I think there is a lot of truth to this. It needs to stay at a strategic kind of level and not get into the weeds. But it also, in a cooperative, they still also have to have some tie into the members. It has to be a little more than what you would get in an investor-owned business, right? And so I think that listening and building that listening capacity is what is critical to distinguishing the co-op model and a successful co-op model from a not that. There's people who describe, I think, quite accurately that modern businesses are businesses in corporate forms historically, or were like original AI in a sense that if you think of a large corporation, it builds systems that make decisions, and the humans are kind of backgrounded, right? And if you've ever had a frustrating encounter with an airline or a telecom company, and you run into these systematic responses, you're speaking to someone to say, "I can't make a decision here. The rules say," right? And that's what a co-op does. It should be able to kind of soften that. It should be able to bend that a little bit. It shouldn't be acting in an algorithmic way like its competitors do. And so that to me is a critical matter. I think on a leadership side of things too, I think the best co-op credit union leaders I've seen are, interestingly, former politicians who are not afraid. They're not business people, but they're people. They're really good, and they're not afraid to have difficult conversations with people. I find a lot of conventional leaders, they come to the AGM and they just want it to be done. They don't want to have a challenging conversation. They don't want anyone to pose a question that's going to cause them to sweat. But a politician, that's all they do. They just live in that space. And so especially if there's they have some legitimacy, that can really be a powerful way to kind of live out that cooperative difference, have those courageous conversations, and set the direction that needs to be set for good, effective organizational performance. So I think those are a couple things I would flag.
Well, and I think what Marc-Andre even just saying about how politicians sometimes make great leaders of cooperatives, in part is because cooperatives are at their root democratic organizations, right? The board is elected to represent the members, and so they are actually to be accountable to members. And I think to this point, there's been sort of a trend in sort of, especially in the cooperative governance world, around saying we need people who are technocratic experts to be on the board, people who've run these very large or really understand the financial details about how everything works. And and I think moving away from this notion that regular people can actually oversee and govern these large complex organizations. And I think to Marc-Andre's point, you want the board to be the sort of guiding light for the mission and the purpose, right, of the organization. That's their primary role. Their primary role is not to make sure that the audit is you hire people to help with those kinds of things. And so I think that that's something that we also have to talk about when we talk about good governance or good governance practices. You want people who are going to ask tough questions. You want people who can hold tensions, like really carefully, and aren't scared to have the difficult conversations, the stressful conversations. We're going to sort of move away from that. You want people who are going to lean in and really engage with their members and engage with the trade-offs that have to be made in difficult strategic decisions. Great example, we've done some research around, mergers in credit unions where they have to close branches in communities. And that's always a really controversial set of decisions that a credit union has to make. But the ones that really connect with their members and have these conversations and talk to them about, what there's like, what the reasoning is for this, even engaging members prior to the decision and saying, here are the challenges we're facing, right? If we're not getting the business in the community, this is sort of the path we're on. And so, engaging them even in the solution. And in some cases, actually being able to reverse the decision because members have been able to get on board. And I think the board can play a really important role in that regard. Not getting too involved in the day-to-day operations. That's why you hire good managers. But I think really helping set that purpose and having those conversations more broadly with the membership about the direction, about the purpose, and playing a real education role among the members as well.
Mm. Yeah, that is a really useful reminder of the role of governance, and we'll certainly touch on that later on as well. So, yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. So, what we're going to shift to now is one of the themes of our Leaders Summit, which is capital. So, always something that people are grappling with around the world. So, this is not just the raising of capital, but how capital structures interact with member control, how they interact with liquidity, and then how they interact with long-term strategy. So in New Zealand, you've mentioned before, we've seen some recent farmer shareholder votes on some really strategic major decisions, including proposals at Alliance Group and at Fonterra. So from your knowledge of how co-ops manage capital in practice, what do you see as the most important governance questions co-op leaders should be asking themselves about capital today?
I think Dionne and I agreed I would tackle this one first. So, I just earlier today, somebody shared around a little piece with me that I really like, and it kind of lands on this question. And they said, cooperative boards, management should be thinking about this capital question from the perspective of three P's. That's not the triple bottom line, but the three P's. And the P's are presence, like physical presence. If you're in a grocery business, your stores, or if you're an ag co-op, your points of service with your members, that kind of thing. Patronage, and proportion. And by proportion, they mean the allocation of patronage in the form of equity versus holding back reserves in unallocated equity. So what share of your surplus do you park in unallocated equity that the co-op can use at will, versus what share do you park in allocated equity that's in the member's name, versus what share do you pay out in cash, right? And so as a co-op, you should be kind of thinking about balancing those kind of three pieces, those three P's. I'd also say you should be planning well in advance, anticipating, if you have a wave of members who are aging out and kind of getting to the retirement, and they're farmers, for example, how are you going to make sure they're whole? How are you going to make sure when you're making them whole, you're not removing your capacity to reinvest in the business for the next generation of farmers, right? So you need to be thinking about what we call that horizon issue, the horizon problem, while you're thinking about placement of your services, and that's really a service-oriented kind of mindset. The patronage, how much are you going to pay out? And then the proportions, how are you going to do it? What's going to sit with the business? What's going to be with the members? So I think those are, I would say, a good co-ops that kind of have this sustainability mindset, are thinking about balancing those three things always, right? So it's kind of service now versus, right, you're investing in service versus paying out in cash. And there's always this tension in co-ops in New Zealand, Canada, doesn't matter where you are. Members often want to see the money now, right? But you need to kind of be, and this is where we come back to what Dionne was saying, you need to be having these big strategic conversations with your members, as owners, as users, as controllers, as beneficiaries. You need to bring them in that conversation so they understand why maybe you're not going to pay out a lot of patrons this year. Maybe you're going to plow it back into the business so you can do the service better and you can do that placement part of things, right? Again, it's like there's this kind of virtuous circle when you start integrating and focusing your business, your execution through the lens of your cooperative business or your organizational form. And I think this is where a lot of co-ops fall down, is they forget to center that. And Dionne said this earlier, they forget to center it and filter all their decision making through that lens. So that's one way I think, if I see co-ops that are doing well, they're generally playing with that equation somehow, and and in the best cases, I'd say, like we have this cooperative called Bee Made Honey Producers. I think they've been having that conversation about, yeah, hey guys, we need to reinvest in some productive capacity. That means you might not be getting as much back in the next few years, and let's have that conversation. And once you do that, you get the buy-in, then you get this kind of virtuous circle of good behavior all around and good outcomes.
Yeah. And I'll just add, practically speaking, right, that, again, the conversations, the planning, all of this is important, but many cooperatives, especially ones that have a lot of like this value in terms of that could be extracted. And we've seen this play out in Canada in demutualizations of large insurance mutuals that have been around for a very long time. And even in the cases of our large cooperative retailing system, members wanting to unlock that value that they haven't been the only ones who've created, right? The co-op has been around for 100 years, and they are not the only ones who have generated that value that is in the co-op. But there's sort of this incentive, and sometimes there's nefarious characters sometimes too outside of the co-op system that kind of encourage and incentivize that behavior to like demutualize. But so in just a practical sense, co-ops, like board directors should be asking, like, do we have safeguards in our bylaws so that the co-op might not be like, it might actually protect it a bit better from, say, a group of like a group of specific members who might just want to kind of like, unlock the value and move on and don't worry so much about the sustainability of the organization into the long term. So I think that's a very practical thing that board directors can ask themselves, in addition to having these conversations about, we have a co-op that owns a large oil refinery in Canada, and it's aging infrastructure, right? Having those conversations with members. But also, if you have to make these major capital investments that are, over the long term, they're going to have to sort of protect some of that capital that they have in the cooperative as well. So I think asking also the practical questions around how you have these payouts of members who are aging out or pass away, or as you engage in that kind of generational turnover as well.
There's a great example just next door to New Zealand, right in Australia, Cooperative Bulk Handling. I don't know if you're familiar with that organization.
I'm not, no.
But they handle their grain handling company, cooperative. They had this conversation about capital and unlocking value, and this has been going on for 30, 40 years, right? And then in the 90s, there was this kind of fervor of, well, we can't raise capital, so we've got to demutualize. This is the only way. And a lot of the management of these organizations fell into this fallacy form of thinking, and they were no longer managing these 3 Ps or the 4 Ps that I'm suggesting. They're like, well, we can't do it, so let's just float some shares in the exchange, and we'll cease to be a cooperative. So anyway, in cooperative bulk handling case, the management was pushing this line. Fortunately, some members rallied and said, you know what, this is a false story that's being sold to us, and they took control of the board. They reoriented that organization to be exclusively focused on that placement kind of service orientation. We're not going to pay patronage, but we're going to be the lowest cost provider of these services in Australia. And they got through some tough times, and now they're incredibly prosperous because they have this very clear focus, because they had the conversation with the members around, and they got the buy-in of the members. Again, they're not customers, they're not suppliers, they're owners, users, controllers, and beneficiaries. You have to think of those four roles. And once you have that conversation, it takes real courageous leadership to do that, and you get the buy-in, then you can really turn the business around. You can raise the capital. You can hold back the surpluses you need to hold back to invest in the business, to be competitive, and to outcompete globally scaled multinationals. So I think this is, I don't buy the story that there's you can't do this stuff. You have to have the right leadership who has the right mindset and the membership that's engaged.
Mm.
And then you can solve these capital issues, right?
Yeah, that is a really, I guess, interesting way to think about it. And I love what you talked about at the very beginning of this part of the conversation around almost the idea of an equation. So there are the levers that you need to be thinking about and the levers that you can pull, and then what are the ones that you as a cooperative, can do first or easiest, but considering it as a system and as an equation, because all of those things must happen.
And then critically reporting out to your members and saying,
Yes.
here's why
Yes.
we are doing what we are doing. We're
Yes.
weighting it this way because we think this is what's in your best interest, or we've heard you say this is what you want. So they see it. It's not just existing over there and it's being done to you. It's you're part of that process. And again, it's like we've lost a lot of our democratic instinct and capacity in Western societies, and a good cooperative should be always working to build that, basically, and understanding getting that buy-in and the legitimacy is the critical asset of a cooperative, just like it is for a society or nation state, right?
Mm, mm. So you've talked about the long-term perspective. You've talked about aging infrastructure and the fact that you need to have these kinds of conversations with members earlier. So for co-ops that are managing assets and member relations that span generations, how do you think leaders should think about capital decisions when that time horizon could be 30 years, it could be 50 years, rather than next quarter?
Go ahead,
Dionne, you want to take a
Marc-Andre.
crack? Or...
Well, yeah, go ahead. It's still kind of around that sort of.
It feels like it's a bit of the same conversation, but there needs to be a clear plan to anticipate those kind of, that retiring out of your members, right? The example I gave you, the cooperative bulk handling example in Australia, we had a counterpart in Canada called Saskatchewan Wheat Pool, and we had wheat pools in Manitoba, the other big ag province, and Alberta. We had three giant wheat pools that were like the cooperative bulk handling, did the same thing, and they fell into the same trap, but they didn't escape the trap like the cooperative bulk handling did. So they found themselves in the early 90s confronting a newly globalized market. They had aging infrastructure, and they had members who'd been around for 50 years, 40 years. And then, I don't know if this is the case in New Zealand, but our farmers tend to work till they're 90. So it's not 30 years, it's like 40, 50 years. These guys just keep going to the fields, right? But they all started nearing the retirement age at the same time, at the very moment where the wheat pools had to reinvest. They had to build bigger terminals, they had to consolidate, they had to modernize, and they faced this irreconcilable tension. They didn't have the courageous conversations 5 years before. They didn't anticipate. And I think that's the critical thing. You have to anticipate, you have to educate. So your members, if you do have that kind of bulge of looming retirees who want their allocated equity paid out, and of course they should, you have to kind of set them up for the conversation. It's like, yeah, we were going to do this, but it might not all be at once, because we have to reinvest, and we need to do that for your children, for the communities that we serve. We need to think in that kind of intergenerational sense that Dionne was saying, earlier, because we're a business, but we're more than a business too. We're an intergenerational trust, right? And so let's.
And I'll just add, like this notion of the intergenerational issues is actually, there's other kinds of ways, like that's a form of member diversity, right? You have older members and younger members. There's also other forms of membership diversity within co-ops, right? You have rural and urban sort of members, or you have, you just have members with different preferences, especially as co-ops grow. And so co-ops always have to kind of be like balancing these competing member interests in different ways. And so I think, one of the things I would say is to create these opportunities for those members to come together to talk about, their different interests. I mean, in the cooperative retailing system in Western Canada, that has been very, very successful, multi-billion dollar system. That is a second-tier co-op that's owned by 160 local retail co-ops across Western Canada, and they have regular meetings where delegates and representatives at the management level, at the sort of elected levels, come together and talk about all of their different concerns and issues, and what they want their sort of wholesaler logistics distribution company to be focusing on, and they have like real lively conversations and don't always agree. But through that process, you're getting build-in, right? It's not just about going out and selling a vision from the top down. It's about building that vision together. And as a result of those interactions, the members, who have different preferences, different time horizons, different needs, they start to understand that the co-op is balancing all of these things. And so they're also willing to give and take a little bit as well, right, in that process. And so I think, again, it comes back to that. And also, again, just I think education about what the co-op is, where it's come from, its history, right, and why it's so important for the sustainability of the co-op to keep going, to keep addressing these issues, so that it's not just about the current membership. It's been there for previous members. They want it to be there for future members. And so how do we ensure that we balance this intergenerational tension as well?
Dionne, just to add to that, Dionne mentioned the co-op you can think of as a political organization. And it's so true. I mean, back to the retailing system, we do these governance courses, and we have these board members who come take our training. They're from British Columbia, which is a very kind of green province, very climate change sensitive province.
Yeah.
And then right next door is Alberta, an oil producing province, and the potential clash of interests there is fascinating. It plays out with our governance training. It plays out in the AGMs. It plays out all over. But by sharing a purpose, it's no different than a nation state with the diversity of people who live in a nation state. I don't know what New Zealand's like, but Canada's got 10 countries in one, basically, and more. You need some sense of higher order objective. And that's how you glue the whole thing together, right? And see, again, you need a leadership and a board that's kind of acutely aware that, yeah, we're a business, but we're more than that. And we need to have these big conversations. And our members are owners. They're our citizens. We need to bring them into this conversation in a meaningful way. And that's how you'll reconcile that. That's how you'll manage these tensions for capital planning. You have to have that shared kind of DNA. Otherwise, it's not going to work.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think this conversation's been incredibly interesting and really leads into the next phase, which is the conversation around governance. So we've already talked a lot about governance and the importance of leadership. So yeah, it'd be really interesting to stay with governance for a little bit and just think about co-op boards often rely on directors who bring deep sector experience. And I know you've touched on this, but they might serve for quite long periods. So what sort of governance practices can help co-ops refresh their boards but retain institutional knowledge? And I mean, what I've experienced here just from conversations with members is, we have some incredibly large, very, very well-established cooperatives and mutuals with, incredibly professional boards. And at the same time, we also have a lot of really small cooperatives where they're drawing from their members, and their members are absolutely amazing subject matter expertise in the cooperative itself. But as you said earlier, they may not necessarily be experienced in asking tough questions, or challenging. So I'm just really keen to understand your perspective on the cooperative and the governance succession.
Well, I mean, I think one way of sort of making sure that you maintain some of that institutional memory is, just a practical suggestion is around staggered terms, right? That you actually sort of think about, because I think sometimes you get these co-ops where everybody just changes over, and that's not a good thing. So I think just practically staggered terms to sort of maintain some of the institutional memory, have some of that learning, have director orientation, is really critical in terms of succession planning. Having the board constantly be on the lookout and trying to sort of talk to people about the importance of getting involved in governance, and then even thinking about specifically sending board directors for governance training, and specifically governance training on cooperatives, because I think a lot of co-op boards send their board members to take just sort of classic governance training, which can be useful. There's a lot of overlap, right? Like I said, a lot of best practices that exist across organizations. But a lot of the things we've been talking about are not things that are discussed in terms of the important role of a cooperative board, and how it has it does have to take a different lens to a lot of the same kinds of questions. And so I think cooperative education and cooperative governance is critical. And again, I will sort of say that I think one of the things co-ops worry about is they worry about not getting the sort of technical expertise on the board. I think technical expertise is really helpful, but I will also say that just because somebody is a technical expert doesn't mean they're also good at asking tough questions. In fact, if you get a bunch of people who sort of come from a similar business training, right? They might have a lot of in-depth sort of expertise about a specific area, but they might all think exactly the same way. What you want is a diversity of perspectives on the board, so that they'll ask the questions that come from a variety of different perspectives. And I think that courage to ask difficult questions is something that boards have to really think about. How do you put in place practices and processes to ensure that people are willing to ask tough questions, that they don't just engage in groupthink or go along with the crowd? And in our governance training, we talk about a lot of like small tips for that, right? About how to sort of encourage people to take on more of that role. And a big part of it too is creating a good culture within the board, where that kind of thing is encouraged, expected, and rewarded. It's not just that we go along with the CEO because the CEO has brought the proposal forward, and we're all good friends with the CEO of knowing that person forever, know they're a good person and a great leader and have done a great job for the co-op. That might all be true, but it's still that you have to make sure that you're asking all of the questions, and not sort of. And I think this is again a tension in co-ops, is that I think sometimes the people who can ask the best questions are not the people who have all of the technical expertise, because they can see things sometimes that people can't. And so I think definitely getting a mix of people on the board, not just looking for people who all have like advanced degrees and that kind of thing, but also the people who are really drawn from the membership, really understand what the purpose of the co-op is and how it impacts their community and their lives.
If I can lean in on that, in a former life, I was a Bloomberg reporter, so a financial markets reporter, and I covered our Bay Street, which is like our Wall Street, right, in Canada. And so I talked to market participants every day, and after a while, I got really good at predicting what they were going to say. Like I could tell you to a person what they're going to say, in part because they all shared the same view. I have never seen herding in the same way that I did in, financial herding is orders of magnitude more intense than in any other sector in the economy, I would suggest. And so, you're getting when you get a purely skilled board, you're getting people who think almost exactly the same way. And so this is what Dionne's point about, and leaning into your co-op model again is so important. I can't stress enough, and asking, and I'd often interview them, and I'd ask them sometimes a disarmingly simple question, and you'd see them stunned. They couldn't compute how that question could come at them, and that's what you need in a board. You need people who are going to sometimes ask those questions, because it's going to unlock a really important conversation. Just one more thing I wanted to say on this topic is we have in the province of Quebec, which is our kind of the province with the kind of the most developed cooperative sector in Canada. It used to be Saskatchewan, where we are, but it's now Quebec, the French-speaking province. They have an organization called Co-op Fédéré, and they have this very intentional strategy of bringing in the next generation of board members. They have like almost like a little. They're not delegates. They're like they get people to volunteer in each of the regions of the province to act as like almost like a secondary level of the board. So these people get privileged access to strategic conversations, internal documents, and the expectation is that they're going to go out in turn and have those conversations with the local people that they interact with every day. And so then you're building, and they've got a few hundred of these people, and they devote resources to working with these people, right? Again, it's that education and training and investing in the model. And so this is a way of disseminating conversations across a large membership, but also building that bench strength for the next round of board members. So I think anytime if you think in terms of that kind of sustainability of your governance structure, you should be investing in it, because that is core to your model. This is your strength. And if you shortchange your governance structure, you're shortchanging you're putting one arm behind your back. This is the kind of, the message I want to leave here today is use your governance model, see it as a strategic advantage. That means you got to invest in it, right? And I think it's too easy for cooperatives to say to themselves, oh, the AGM, we just want to make sure we get through this. And they kind of downplay and they don't invest in that. And that's where things start going off the rails.
Well, this has been an incredibly rich discussion about governance and capital and succession, and we've definitely covered a lot of ground. So before we wrap up and close, I'd really like to ask each of you just one final question. So if you could leave cooperative directors and CEOs with one idea to think about as they lead their organization for the next sort of 30 to 50 years, what would that be?
I mean, I think I would say, it's repeating a little bit what we've said before, but really leaning into your democratic structure, your ownership and governance, and not sort of just seeing that as something you have to get through. And I think this is tied to maybe the broader sort of piece of advice I'd give is don't lose sight of your broader purpose as a cooperative. You're not engaging in getting profits for profit's sake or growth for growth's sake. You're engaging in that as a means to an end, to a bigger end. And so always think about it that way, right? In some cases, you're not going to maximize profits because that's not going to get you to the broader end. It's what is enough for you to actually meet your broader purpose. And I think a lot of co-ops fall into this sort of this growth for growth's sake trap, because it's sort of what we, I think, are socialized into thinking that getting bigger and bigger and bigger is always better. It's not always the case. So I think not losing sight of that broader purpose, and really leaning into the co-op governance as a comparative advantage, a competitive advantage for your organization.
So Dionne stole my answer, but but it's like, I would summarize as like working your core, right? Like this is your core identity and you use it, right? But I'll just complement the answer by saying, I think the other part of that is, and we're in university context, but so maybe we're a little biased, but education, the culture, your human software, like your human hardware, you gotta really nurture that. You gotta invest in that stuff, that stuff that is not so fashionable in an AI world where you want to delegate all the decision making to some large language model. God forbid. I hope people aren't thinking that way, but if they are, this is not the way to approach it. You need to invest in your people. We had a fellow, Harold Chapman, just passed away. He was 105 years old. He worked in the cooperative sector forever, and he was an evangelist for the cooperative sector. And his central message was education, education, education. If you're not investing in helping people understand the model, those four pieces of the identity that Dionne talked about, use, own, control, and beneficiary, if you're not reminding them that it's more than just a customer, if you're not recognizing the political nature of the business, if you're not thinking of that intergenerational perspective, you're not going to succeed as a co-op. So you need to invest in all that. And that's your strength.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think what you have just covered today has given, us as the peak body a lot of incredibly useful and practical ideas about how we can support our members as well moving forward as they're grappling with these challenges that we've talked through in our conversation today. So Dionne and Marc-Andre, thank you both very much for sharing your insights. And for cooperative leaders here in New Zealand, conversations like this remind us that so many of the challenges that we face locally
are actually part of a much broader global conversation about how member-owned enterprises can succeed across generations.